Okay, well that's a good question. I get that question a lot. There's a couple of reasons. I was raised in a small town in rural northeastern Iowa, surrounded by farmers. I was not a farmer myself, but my father was, and all my friends were farmers. And I spent a lot of time on a farm growing up. And so I have spent much of my life around production agriculture, around food being produced. Equally, I'm an eater, like we all are. And so in that kind of unique spot of being so close to production and also being intimately associated with food as an eater, I began to see things that interested me. Things like, why is it that I'm drinking milk that came from cows in California while outside of my town were large cow farms with over 1,000 head of cows, and why was that milk being processed and being shipped to, say, New York State? And so I started to become really interested in why our food system looks the way it does. Why is it that I'm drinking milk from California when my best friend has a very large cow farm whose milk goes to New York? And so that started to get me really interested in wanting to better understand it. And then I discovered as a social scientist that you could actually start unpacking some of those questions and thinking about food in ways that are really quite innovative and novel, and that go beyond, say, what you might be taught if you were an agricultural economist or an ecologist. And I have a feeling we're going to be asked those questions later, so I'll leave a further response till then. One big piece of that is going beyond thinking about food linearly. And so this gets into, I have lots of wonderful friends who are ag economists, and when we tend to think about food or in disciplines such as ag economics, sometimes the thinking is very linear, where it starts with the farmer and goes to the processor and goes to the retailer and goes to a consumer. But then when you start thinking about it as a social scientist or a sociologist or an anthropologist, you begin realizing that there's more players, there's more people who populate our food system than those people that are on that linear chain. And so part of the thing that I am really interested in understanding is, what are the other actors, who are the other actors that play a role in not only producing our food, but also in shaping what type of foods we eat, what do we choose to eat, who do we think about when we think about our food. When we think about food, we tend to only think about how much it costs, or we tend to reduce it to what's in the United States called the nutrition facts. You know, what's on the label, how much vitamin A does it have, how much fat does it have. We don't think about, for instance, the laborers that were behind our food. We don't think about the climate change that might be linked to our production agriculture. And so I'm really interested in questions of, why is it that we don't think about some of those things, and perhaps what can we do to help get eaters. I like thinking about people as eaters rather than consumers. How can we get eaters to start thinking about those other elements of our food system that we otherwise might ignore? And I think that's a key point for creating social change too, to opening our understanding about how we think about our food systems beyond what I would argue is a relatively narrow understanding of food. When I think about it in an embodied context as well, we also have to remember that, say you want to create or change people's behaviors when it applies to eating different foods or getting people to eat more nutritious foods. And so there's this idea that there's this nutritional literacy campaign that's happening in the United States, where the assumption is that people just don't know what healthy foods are. And if people suddenly discovered and learned what a healthy food was, they'd start eating it, which first of all is kind of ludicrous or ridiculous on its face, because I've never interviewed anyone who doesn't realize that fresh fruits and vegetables are not healthy. There's obviously other things going on here that explain why people eat the way they do, that go beyond just the idea that they somehow don't know what healthy food is. And so to get to this embodied piece, to fold this in, it's the idea that, for instance, we may not know how to select fresh fruits and vegetables. So in the United States, we don't know how to select a fresh cantaloupe. You know, we know we're supposed to shake it, and we know it's supposed to sound a particular way, or we know we're supposed to thump it, but we don't know what a ripe thump sounds like and a non-ripe thump sounds like, for instance. So there's these elements that we don't think about when we're trying to teach people how to eat healthy. We also have to convey to them the knowledge of how to select fresh fruits and vegetables, how to carve a turkey. Who knows how to carve a turkey anymore? And you can't really learn that from a YouTube video. You have to experience it and you have to practice it. So I try to remind people too that there's this embodied component, there's this element of practice, there's this element of learning with people who can put your hand on an asparagus to tell you how it's supposed to feel when that asparagus is ripe or overripe. And so that is a piece of what my research talks about, is trying to bring in and remind people that there's these embodied elements to knowledge that cannot be conveyed in a book or through a documentary or a YouTube video. What do the social sciences contribute to kind of how we think about food? Yeah, it's an excellent question. I'll kind of conclude by giving one example that I like a lot, that maybe pertains most in the States, I'm not sure, but we have in the United States a growing craft brewery industry where small companies are growing microbrews, and these beers are very expensive compared to, say, the Budweisers or the Coors of the world. And I have had a number of farmers who sell foods at farmers markets express frustration to me why one person that morning will come to them and be outraged that they're having to pay $5 or $6 for a dozen free-range organic eggs, yet that night go to a bar and spend $10 on a pint of beer that they consume in 30 minutes. And I mean, it's an interesting question. During the recession in the United States, the consumption of craft brewed beer actually increased while our consumption of lots of other things went down. And I think part of the reason why that is that microbrewed beer is what I like to call convivial. It's very social. When people consume craft beer, they tend to consume it with others. Whereas if you're consuming what we would call a macro brew, like Budweiser, you're more likely to consume that by yourself. And so I like that example because it reminds us that there are these convivial elements to our food that shape to some degree what we buy and how much we're willing to pay for particular foods. And sometimes we get caught up in this idea that humans are just these economically rational actors that only think about how much something costs. And the point of the social sciences is to remind us that there are these other elements. Price is important, but there's these other social elements that explain why we do what we do. And you can see the same thing when it comes to agriculture too. No farmer gets into farming only to make money, in part because it's hard to get rich in farming. The reason why farmers do what they do in part is because of social and cultural forces that play a significant role in their business management practices and their farming enterprise. And so if we want to understand eaters, and if we want to understand farmers, we have to have a better understanding of some of these social and cultural elements too, if we want to create meaningful policy change and create policies that might alter people's eating behaviors, but in the same respects might alter farming practices too if we're looking to create more sustainable farming practices. So I'd say that's a significant piece of what the social sciences can bringing in the fact that we're just not economic rational actors. We're rational actors, but also rational in the sense we have very legitimate social and cultural reasons for explaining why we do what we do, and we need to understand those. That any change or behavioral change that you're able to create in the short term typically won't last. It typically won't stick. Meaningful social change, meaningful behavioral changes take time. And you have to change people's attitudes, you have to create new norms, you have to create new communities, new social networks sometimes. And it takes time, but if you do that intentionally, you can actually create meaningful social change that lasts through generations and not just will last until that financial incentive, for example, gets pulled away.